Dear friends, have you ever paused to ask yourselves a question? Why is it that South Korea and Japan have become so deeply entangled with the erotic industries? In South Korea, this sector generates nearly 24 trillion won each year, an amount almost sufficient to sustain one-third of the nation's armed forces. Japan presents an even stranger paradox. The more sluggish the economy becomes, the more prosperous this industry appears, with annual revenues soaring to approximately $700 billion. How is it that these two seemingly sophisticated and prosperous nations have sunk ever deeper into this trade, unable to extricate themselves? Today, we attempt to lift the glittering veil and expose the deepest, most painful wound beneath. In 2021, research conducted by a team at Seoul National University detected excessive levels of estrogen-like compounds in the Han River, the lifeline flowing through the heart of Seoul. At first glance, it sounds almost absurd, like a grim joke. Yet upon reflection, it is profoundly chilling. What magnitude of demand must exist for an entire river to register such abnormalities? Some estimates suggest that the number of women engaged in this industry in South Korea may exceed 1 million, accounting for nearly 1/10 of women between the ages of 20 and 40. Even more startling is its economic footprint. The industry contributes approximately 4 to 5% of South Korea's GDP, once again, roughly 24 trillion won. By comparison, the nation's total military budget in 2024 stood at under 60 trillion won. In other words, this single industry alone nearly generates enough revenue to maintain one-third of the country's armed forces. This inevitably raises a question. How did these two nations, each more intensely competitive than the last, arrive step by step at such a reality? The answer cannot be reduced to the simplistic notion of social openness. What lies beneath is a history woven from war, poverty, political bargaining, and the blood and tears of women. Japan is a nation perpetually shadowed by natural disasters. Earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis have never ceased, cultivating a deep-seated sense of existential insecurity. Culturally, this fostered an emphasis on fertility and sexuality. Within myth and tradition, sex was rarely burdened with severe moral judgment, forming a fertile ground for later developments. The true turning point arrived after the Meiji Restoration, amid war and industrial ambition. Eager to emulate Western industrial powers yet crippled by a lack of capital, the Japanese state ultimately turned its gaze toward impoverished women. According to Japanese scholars, during the Meiji era alone, more than 100,000 women were systematically sent overseas, compelled to earn the nation's first accumulation of capital through sexual exploitation. Following defeat in the Second World War and the arrival of American forces, Japan once again established a state-sanctioned system of brothels dedicated to serving occupying troops. Within just 6 months, records show that rates of sexually transmitted diseases among U.S. soldiers increased eightfold. As the economy recovered, the issue faded temporarily from public view. Yet when the economic bubble burst in the 1990s and unemployment surged, countless women were once again forced into the industry. Today, Tokyo alone may host close to 1 million workers in this sector, generating annual revenues of roughly $700 billion. Economic decline and erotic expansion thus feed one another in a vicious, inescapable cycle. Compared with Japan, South Korea's story is even heavier with sorrow. The Korean peninsula, long shaped by Confucian ethics, once upheld deeply conservative social values. The rupture came during the period of Japanese colonial rule, when the comfort women's system was imposed, utterly shattering existing moral and social structures. After Japan's surrender, American forces entered Korea. In exchange for aid and military protection, the South Korean government tacitly permitted, and at times actively encouraged, women to provide sexual services to U.S. troops. United Nations data from 1953 indicate that approximately 300,000 Korean women were involved in such transactions around American military bases. In the 1960s, Park Chung-hee initiated the so-called miracle on the Han River. Yet behind this economic ascent lay immense sacrifice. At least 30% of the foundations of this miracle were built upon women's suffering. In 1962, the government formally legalized prostitution, designated red light districts, and rebranded the women involved as Western princesses and civilian diplomats. Official figures from 1966 reveal that this industry accounted for nearly 1/4 of South Korea's foreign exchange earnings. Subsequently, Chun Doo-hwan's so-called 3S policy further normalized sexual commerce by allowing various establishments to operate it covertly. South Korea gradually entered an era of pervasive sexualization. Statistics suggest that more than half of young men at the time had purchased sex, with such practices becoming embedded in business and social networking. Although President Roh Moo-hyun later launched large-scale crackdowns, the underlying issues of employment and survival remained unresolved, driving the industry underground. By the time Park Geun-hye left office, the number of individuals involved in the erotic economy had surpassed 1 million. Scandals such as the Nth Room, the Burning Sun affair, and the case of Zhang Zhiyun successively came to light, each pointing toward the entanglement of conglomerates and political elites. Women lost their lives, while those wielding real power consistently escaped unscathed. Thus, whether in Japan or South Korea, the proliferation of the erotic industries has never been merely a question of morality. Its roots run deep into the scars of war, national impoverishment, political expediency, and the systemic subjugation of women. A nation's true strength is not measured solely by GDP figures, but by the dignity and rights afforded to every citizen, especially its women. Only when a country stands upright and walks a righteous path can its people live with genuine dignity.